Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Jenny Gentles, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. Today I'm joined by Maine State Representative Laurel Libby. She's a former ICU nurse, a mother, and a lifelong Mainer who stepped into public office after seeing her state take a sharp political turn. Since 2020, she's served in the Maine House, where she's become a leading voice for defending biological reality and fairness in women's sports. Recently, she made headlines and sparked a firestorm after posting about a high school girls' sports competition. That one post led to a censure, stripping her of her ability to vote or speak in the legislature. She's fighting back, and on Monday, she filed an emergency request with the U.S. Supreme Court to stop the censure. In this episode, we dig into what happened, why it matters for free speech and representation, the federal government's investigations into Maine's violations of Title IX and FERPA, and what comes next in Maine and the courts. Representative Laurel Libby, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been off Twitter, or X, for Lent, and I haven't stayed up to date on the twists and turns of what's happening in Maine. So I really appreciate you joining me today to walk through your situation and Maine's questionable policies.
There's a lot to talk about going on in Maine right now, so I'm happy to dive right in.
All right, so you are a registered nurse, from what I understand. You worked as an ICU nurse. You have a number of children. What inspired you in the midst of this extremely busy and full life to run for office?
Well, my husband and I are both born and raised Mainers. And one day, literally in January of 2019, we looked around, and in looking at our beloved state, it was very, very different. And that's politically very, very different from when we were growing up. And so we took stock and realized that if we wanted to have our state back, that we needed to be involved and engaged. And for me, that looked like in 2020 running for office and booting out a two-term Democrat incumbent. And now I'm serving my third term.
Congratulations on that. I noticed that in an event honoring Women's History Month earlier this year, you said, "We're now witnessing a new form of erasure, one where men, simply by declaring themselves women, are rewriting history books and stripping our young women of their right to fair competition. We find ourselves in a battle to preserve the very definition of what it means to be a woman and to preserve the rights for which these trailblazers fought." What does that battle look like in Maine right now?
It's really remarkable. And it literally is by, speaking and saying, I'm a woman, that a biological male can declare that. And that is the truth here in Maine. So our Maine Principals Association, based off a law passed in 2021 here in Maine, allows biological males to participate in girls' sports simply if they say, I now identify as a girl. And so we have seen males participating in girls' sports, taking girls' trophies, taking their spots on podiums. And it really is erasing girls, erasing women, when their accomplishments can be negated by a simple statement from a biological male that they are now a girl and that they want to participate in girls' sports. It sounds ludicrous coming out of my mouth as I say it, but that's the state of things here in Maine.
Do you think that Maine residents realized that that law was being passed when that happened?
They absolutely did not. There were 7 folks who testified on that bill to add gender identity as a protected class in the Maine Human Rights Act. One of them, I'm proud to say, was a constituent of mine, but the other 6, I believe, were testimonies in support. And it was thought to be a very small technical change. No one realized the dramatic effects that it would have on the laws in our state, but more importantly, on allowing discrimination against Maine women and girls, condoning it even. And so this law is yet another example of hindsight being 2020, and the effect was dramatic. And I think that the folks who sponsored the bill probably understood far more clearly than the rest of us did the ramifications of this change to the law.
Do you have a sense now of who was behind that? Are there activist organizations in the state? Was this pushed from activist organizations outside of the state?
You know, that 20% that want biological males participating in girls' sports is a minority, a small minority, but it's a really vocal minority. And they are the folks pushing for these woke policies in states like Maine. And they are very loud and persistent. And this is one of many changes that we've seen to state law here in Maine that sound small but affect us so dramatically. So, yes, there are entities pushing for changes like these and kind of patting Mainers on the head saying it's no big deal, when it really actually is a very big deal, especially for the 2/3 of Mainers who don't want to see biological males participating in girls' sports.
Yeah, when I've looked into similar changes that happened in Virginia, where I live, and across the country, it seems like there was a push over maybe a 5-year period or so of cut and paste. And there were larger organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, GLAD, GLISTEN. They got out these model policies and just said that this would be kind, this would be considerate, this is what you need to do to ensure that people don't feel discriminated against, without consideration or acknowledgement of what this does to girls and to women. So people in Maine now, I would assume, are very aware of the consequences of the change of this law. And that's largely in part to your work over the last few months, including a social media post about a young man winning a high school girls' pole vault competition. So this seems innocuous enough. You're just pointing out the reality of the consequence of a change of law. Tell us what happened after you posted that.
I posted side-by-side photos of John winning 5th place in the boys' pole vault last year and then winning 1st place as Katie this year. And it sent shockwaves through Maine and beyond. And folks realized, I think, fully that this was indeed happening in Maine. And I don't think we'd had that full of a picture prior. People said, oh, it's not really a big deal. It's not happening. Girls aren't being displaced. And this illustrated really clearly that it was happening. And it reverberated, I think, because a picture's worth 1,000 words. And you can say boys are participating in girls' sports, but when you actually physically see it, that's very different. And so I think Mainers are aware now in a way that they weren't. And I'm thankful for that because they have gotten quite vocal on the issue and have said very clearly that this is unacceptable, that this remain the policy for our state, and that we need to protect our women and girls instead of discriminating against them.
You've said that males competing in female sports, it's unfair, it's unsafe, it's unacceptable. That is the position of 80% of Americans and likely the residents of Maine. You referenced that figure. That is a January poll that showed that when asked directly, individuals across America said, no, we don't want males in women's sports. They're not the only ones. There are plenty of leaders at the state level, at the congressional level, including California Governor Gavin Newsom, saying that this is unfair. So this is not a controversial position. Why has it become such a big deal in Maine?
It's interesting. I have said a few times, I think if Governor Mills had heard Gavin Newsom say that maybe a week or two earlier, maybe we would have seen different words come out of her mouth rather than see you in court. But Gavin Newsom didn't take that stand until shortly thereafter. And, he's a political animal. He can see the writing on the wall, and he knows the results of that polling. And so with his aspirations, it made all the sense in the world that he would come out and say, this is not fair, and acknowledge biological reality. Now, that hasn't equaled changes to policy in California. We've seen the California legislature dig in very staunchly and continue to war against biological reality, just as Governor Mills has been here in Maine. And I think that once you dig in, it's hard to dig back out. And so Governor Mills doubled down and continues to do so, stating that it's about rule of law, when I think we all know it's really about the issue and about the fact that we are actively, our state, discriminating against women and girls in Maine. And when you listen to Governor Mills or the legislative Democrats talk about this issue, they largely ignore the girls involved. And it's really sad. First, they're being erased by biological males being able to take their place, literally take their awards from them in their sports that they've worked so hard for years to achieve, but then they're being erased by Governor Mills and the legislative Democrats who are willfully ignoring them and pushing them aside as they advance this woke agenda that most Mainers don't support.
What happened to you personally after you posted these pictures?
A week later, I was censured by the Democrats in the legislature. It was a partisan vote, 75 to 70. Most folks probably, when you hear the word censure, it's a slap on the wrist, something like that. We saw that recently in Congress in DC. But in Maine, the rule allows for far more than a slap on the wrist. Following my censure, the Speaker of the House declared that I would not be allowed to vote on behalf of my constituents or speak on the floor until I had apologized for my social media post. And so it's a significant infringement on my First Amendment right of free speech. I have not been able to represent my constituents fully in the State House since February 25th. And they are denied their full democratic representation. And so not only have I been silenced, but my 9,000 constituents have been silenced and disenfranchised.
When I saw that you had been censured, and this must have been headlines that were coming out before Lent that I was seeing on Twitter, but then also all over the media, I did just assume that you weren't allowed to speak. This idea that you're not allowed to vote, like how can they get away with that? Is that always the case in Maine, that if you're censured, you're not allowed to vote?
Well, my censure is the fourth censure in our history. Interestingly, all four censures have been against Republicans, and the previous three, they immediately apologized. However, I cannot and will not apologize for simply speaking the truth and defending our women and girls against discrimination. And so here we are, for the first time in Maine history, a censure has meant a prolonged canceling, silencing of a voice and vote. And it continues, though I have filed a court challenge, and that is proceeding. That's really the only recourse we have at this point.
Okay, this idea that you just have to apologize, meaning you have to denounce what you said and you have to pretend that it's not true, I guess. Have they given you the wording of the apology, or they just said, just apologize for what exactly? What you said, or the fact that there was a picture of a high schooler involved?
It's not entirely clear what the apology has to be. It is clear the speaker has said it has to be speaker approved. So
speaker drafted, I guess.
Yeah. So probably no, sorry, I didn't speak up sooner. That probably wouldn't fly. Yeah, it's really pretty arbitrary, and not only arbitrary, but if you think about it, I mean, this is coerced speech to apologize for exercising free speech. It's just infringement after infringement on our right to free speech, which is protected by the Constitution.
And not just yours, as you said, the 9,000 constituents you represent. What are they saying in response to this?
Certainly they're frustrated. You know, we are in the minority. There are 73 Republicans and there are 76 Democrats and a couple independents. So we're only a few seats away, and they're frustrated that their representative is not allowed to vote. You know, they voted me in, and they're fully capable of voting me out in 2026. That should be their right. If they don't like what I had to say, right, that's their right to vote me out. And that's the beauty of our system of government, is that the people should have that say. To have the government take it into their own hands and take that away from my constituents is reprehensible. They're frustrated, but they have encouraged me to continue fighting. There are, you know, a couple, I would say they fall in that 20%, right, who think it's fine that biological males should be taking girls' place in Maine, and they want me to apologize. But the vast majority have said, thank you for speaking up. You are speaking on our behalf. You are right on this issue, and keep fighting.
I have cousins and family who live in Maine, and they're just good people, the kind of people who sew a baby blanket for you, you know, and who just welcome you so warmly when you go visit. They're also very low key people, like not people who want to stir things up. So I don't know if that's temperamentally reflective of Mainers, but I wonder if it is hard to speak up if you're the kind of low key, good people, work hard, take care of your family, don't stir things up kind of folks.
I think even more than hard to speak up, and it is. I've heard, particularly from girls who are participating in sports and don't like what is going on, but are afraid to speak up. But I think even more than that, Mainers are independent-minded folks who just want to live their lives and be left alone by and large. And that's really hard to do when you have an overreaching government that is getting more and more involved in your daily life. And I think that is one of the reasons that folks don't speak up more, but we're seeing more and more people speaking up because I think the infringement by our government in far more than just this area is becoming so untenable that even folks who just want to live their lives and be left alone see that they have no choice but to speak up and start getting involved because our state is disappearing.
Well, for the people who aren't yet comfortable, certainly courage is contagious. So the stance that you've taken is important. And then also the fact that you're representing their position when they're still building up the courage to speak up is important. I hear you saying that legally you're fighting back on this censure. Can you tell us where you are in that process?
We filed in federal district court just about 2 weeks after I was first censured in the beginning of March. And that went to a judge in Rhode Island as Maine judges all recused themselves. There was a familial relationship between the male pole vaulter's parent. They worked at the court. So we were assigned to a judge in Rhode Island, and unfortunately, we did not prevail in Rhode Island. So we filed a emergency appeal with the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Now that is still proceeding through the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Our emergency injunction was denied by that court. So what that means is our case will take the normal longer length of time. And so as that is proceeding through that court, we have also filed on Monday, we filed an emergency appeal through the Supreme Court asking for immediate relief and for me to get my vote back, as that is the really critical piece that my constituents need to have in order to not continue to be disenfranchised.
And you've mentioned the constitutional grounds before. Why would the Supreme Court take this up?
The Democrat majority's stance is that essentially they're above the Constitution and that they have absolute legislative immunity to punish a sitting legislator any way that they want. And I would argue, and I think the Constitution is pretty clear, that no one is above the Constitution, no one is above the law, even the Maine legislature and even the Maine Democratic majority in the legislature. And so we would posit that their legislative immunity is not absolute, and it's certainly not absolute when they're infringing on the rights of a sitting legislator to exercise her First Amendment right to free speech, and also my constituents' right to representation.
Well, we'll follow those developments with great interest. And we're also following what's happening with the federal government. You were in Washington, D.C. a week or so ago when the Department of Justice was announcing, I believe, a civil lawsuit against Maine. Was it specifically the Maine Department of Education? And the Secretary of Education was announcing the possibility of Maine losing federal funding. Tell us about that event and what's happening with those federal developments.
Well, Maine has rightfully been under a microscope since that post first went viral back in February. And the fact is that we are not complying with Title IX. And I think that the law is pretty clear there as far as that requirement to comply in order to get those federal funds. And so given that Governor Mills and the Democrat majority have continued to double down and continue to discriminate against Maine women and girls. Unfortunately, the federal government has had to step in to attempt to protect them and restore their rights. And that looks like suing the state of Maine in order to be able to withhold those federal funds that Maine is due if we were not discriminating against women and girls. And so this was bound to end up in the courts, given how Governor Mills has doubled down and pushed this agenda forward to allow biological males to continue participating in girls' sports. And so this is a natural consequence, I think, that was always going to happen since she first uttered that challenge to President Trump, see you in court.
Right. And it's not just a personal thing between Governor Mills and President Trump. As you said, this is Maine very intentionally violating a federal law, Title IX. And that federal law is very clear that women deserve protection when it comes to sex segregated spaces and sports. And all of that has been made clear legally over the last year because the Biden administration attempted to undo that and the courts said no. So this is not just the will of President Trump or the Attorney General or the Secretary of Education. This is the law of the land, and Maine is violating that. I noticed that Maine is also being investigated for a FERPA violation, which is protection of privacy for student records, and then also provides parents with access to student records. So are you aware of policies in Maine where school districts are hiding information about students from their parents?
Yeah, a recent study suggested that about 1/3 of Maine school districts, or a little more, have policies that allow for social workers, teachers, et cetera, to hide information from parents. And several years ago, again, this all comes through the legislature, there was a bill passed while I was in the legislature that would allow social workers to keep secrets from parents in schools. So this is endorsed by the legislature, the Democrat majority of the legislature, to be clear. But this is policy that has been endorsed by Democrat majority, by Governor Mills, and this is absolutely happening in Maine schools. And part of being under that microscope allowed this to come to light. You know, it's not the same issue, but it is similar, and it's being advanced by the same folks. And it is only natural that this would be investigated as well. Parental rights absolutely trump social workers' right to keep secrets from parents, and parents should be informed about what's going on. And unfortunately, our school districts and the legislature think otherwise in Maine.
Well, they can't. It could be that activists want them to do that. Activists want to change reality, but you can't change reality. There are males and females, there are boys and girls, there are federal protections when it comes to women's sports and spaces, and there are federal protections when it comes to parents' access to information about their students. So again, this is not a personal fight. It's not about you personally. It's not about Governor Mills personally. This is Maine consistently and willfully violating federal law, and there are consequences for that. Representative Libby, thank you so much for standing strong. This likely has not been an easy year for you, but please know that it's appreciated by parents like me and by those of us who are wanting to protect girls and women and also vulnerable students who are caught up in gender ideology and their parents and their parental rights. How can people stay up to date on what's happening in Maine and with you?
Yeah, folks can follow me both on X and on Facebook, and also at my website, standwithlaurel.com. And I would add one thing, not to contradict you on the personal nature of this battle, but where it's personal. Since getting involved back in February and hearing so many stories, I've realized that this is an incredibly personal battle. And it's an incredibly personal battle on behalf of young women who shouldn't have to fight this. Whether it is one girl that I've talked to and had a lot of interaction with that first had to change in front of a boy in a locker room in 7th grade, or the young woman who finished second in the pole vault to this young man in February. They worked so hard, and to have their dreams dashed, not just when he won, but literally the minute they walked into that gym and realized that they were going to have to compete against a biological male, and just felt that defeat right away before even competing, because they knew that what was going to happen was a foregone conclusion. And so I keep in front of me all the time that this is a very personal battle for the young women in Maine who are being pushed aside, and they need us to speak up for them, because they think that they are alone and that they don't have representation in this fight. And they need to know that that's not true.
Well, Representative Libby, thank you for speaking up for those young women. Thank you for your commitment to women's safety and to parental rights. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.